What's up, everybody? Today let's talk about alcohol and dating. Now, there's obviously a very intimate relationship between these two, and particularly in terms of secular settings, you're going to find alcohol absolutely everywhere. Now, depending on the church that I go to, right, depending on the congregation that I'm speaking with, and depending on the brother or sister that I happen to be having a conversation with, you're going to find all kinds of different attitudes towards alcohol. Now, at the end of the day, I find it very dangerous to be able to have a very positive or a very negative attitude towards alcohol. At the end of the day, never forget that we worship a God who turned water into wine, not a God who turned wine into water. Now, if you really think about that for a second, that really does say something. You know, individuals who are just tremendous teetotalers to the point where they believe that there should be a total and utter prohibition on alcohol within the faith seem to, for some reason, kind of forget this. But at the end of the day, it is true, everything in moderation. But one of the things that I want to talk to you about today is essentially how it is that alcohol impacts us, the practical implications of that knowledge when it comes to approaching individuals in the context of a dating scenario, be it at church, in small group, just literally out and about. You know, church and small group are not the only ways to be able to meet Christians, right? And other than that, to be able to just kind of really give some practical guidance in terms of if you are currently having issues with alcohol, or maybe you're a little bit afraid that your alcohol consumption is getting, you know, a little bit over the top, right? And first of all, there's a tremendous amount of strength in just recognizing that. So if that's you, I really do want to give you huge kudos for just realizing that that's something you want to work on. I guarantee you, everybody has things that they can work on to be able to further optimize themselves, to make themselves the best versions of themselves as God intended. And ironically, by doing those things and making you the best version of yourself, not only for yourself, but for God and for the church in terms of the body of individuals under God, it's going to also maximize the likelihood that you're going to end up finding your dream person, the person that you desire to be with. So let's go ahead and jump right into that. One preliminary note first, though, is the concept of sin. You know, I think all too often, and as somebody who, you know, didn't grow up as a Christian and found God in my early 20s, I was somebody who anytime that I heard sin, I automatically thought of, you know, the devil with a pitchfork and all these, you know, mini demons and these sorts of things running around. I don't know why, but when I hear the term sin, I think, you know, black, and I think about, you know, lake of fire and hell and all these sorts of things. Like, that's the first thing that jumps to mind. And it's a very kind of, you know, sinners in the hands of an angry God type argument that's kind of meant to terrify you. And we can talk about in another video the practical implications of using hell as that kind of punishing device psychologically, because it makes a lot of sense to be able to give people a fear of something that is punishing. But ironically, it works a heck of a lot better to be able to have something that is positive that is subsequently reinforced, all right? And I think that depending on where you go, you do end up finding some congregations and some segments of the church where there's a lot of emphasis on avoiding fire and brimstone instead of pursuing and trying to adopt the holier things in this world where we can actually pursue God and make a positive impact, right? But the thing with sin is that if you actually think about the literal, ancient meaning of it, right? So just in Hebrew, it's basically to miss the mark, to miss the target. It's an archery term, right? And when I think about it that way, it really, especially for myself as a former atheist, as well as for friends of mine who are not currently believers, and bless them, obviously, for these individuals to be able to talk about sin as, fire and brimstone and demonic and these things, it doesn't make any sense. It's not kind of within the worldview that they currently have. It doesn't make sense to describe it like that. It's not useful in making your points. But if you basically just describe sin as essentially something that, God created all things, and all things have a beautiful purpose. All things are good under God, right? Now, there's certain ways to be able to use things in an unintended fashion, including doing something that's good too often. So doing something that feels good too often can result in a negative outcome, right? And that would be defined as a sin. Not because there's some, like demonic and all these sorts of things, kind of hanging over your head, but rather because it's simply doing something that's intended for a beautiful purpose and basically perverting it, for lack of a better term, right? You're just changing it, you're making it more extreme in that context. And something like substance abuse or substance dependence, including alcohol abuse and dependence, is a great example of that, right? So, if you believe that all things that God created are inherently good, and remember that we always draw the dichotomy between what is good in terms of us as human beings. We usually think if something makes us feel good, then it's good. If something makes us feel bad, then it's bad. God doesn't view good and bad like that, though, right? God's definition of good and bad is something that we will never be able to understand. It's a very, Ecclesiastes situation, right? It's God's wisdom and our capacity for wisdom are so incredibly different that we can spend each and every day reading scripture and talking to elders and brothers and sisters and these sorts of things, and we will never even get like an iota of the way to God's understanding, no matter what we do. And there is a beauty in that almost helplessness, right? But if we believe that if God has created something, then it is, in His eyes, good, or if nothing else, has the capacity to be used for good. If we believe that, then we need to kind of understand that there are also proxies for things. A great example is social media, right? So social media, sometimes it feels like socializing, doesn't it? Or like texting, it feels like we're socializing with somebody, right? Now, it may look and taste and smell and whatever, right, like the real thing, but it's not the real thing, right? It's not the same as sitting down directly across from someone else and actually having that connection, right? And this is just like Splenda, right? Splenda, sucrose, sweet and low, whatever you've got, right? Which is an artificial sweetener, because these artificial sweeteners, usually they look like sugar and they taste like sugar, but that ain't sugar. Right? Now, alcohol, very interestingly, is pretty much the same thing. Now, I don't know if you're a whiskey fan. I'm a whiskey guy, right? So, and Fireball was something that usually, if you were poor, had no money in college like me, Fireball was a pretty good selection. And to be honest, it's pretty great, right? So, every now and again, I will very happily have a shot of Fireball whiskey. So, what happens is that your brain naturally has these different things. I want you to think about it like the dock. Right? The dock where boats can come in and they can basically park themselves, okay? Now, our brains have literally billions of these little docks, right? And they're all over your neurons, which are your brain cells. And a neuron basically looks like a spider. It kind of looks like this, okay? If you zoom up on one, kind of looks like a weird alien-looking thing, right? And the top has all of these tree branch-looking things. And the word tree branch in Greek is dendrite. Right? So these are dendrites, okay? And if you were to zoom in real close, each little arm would end up looking just like a dock, and there would be little parking stations, little docking stations all over them, where little chemicals can fly down and they can attach. Okay? These are little receptors, as they call them, okay? And these things called neurotransmitters, which just means something in the brain that transmits information. They're these little molecules. You've probably heard of a lot of them. You've heard of dopamine. You've heard of serotonin. All I want you to think of them is little ships. And these little ships are going to come and they're going to dock with these dendrites and they're going to send information to the body of the cell, and it's going to tell the cell what to do, okay? Now, principally, a neuron only has two functions, and that's either to fire an electrical impulse or to not fire an electrical impulse. Those are the two different options that you've got, okay? So here's the thing, right? There are all kinds of these different neurotransmitters, I just listed a few for you, right? Which are going to tell the cell to do one of those two things. But there are two amino acids that do this kind of more principally than others. One of them is called GABA, and the other one is called glutamate, okay? Now, GABA basically tells the cell, don't fire, right? Stop, no electrical impulse, nothing, okay? The other one is called glutamate. And glutamate, when it docks, tells the cell, yes, fire a shot down that axon, right? Fire an electrical impulse down that axon. That's what it's trying to tell it, okay? Now, the thing is that just like if you actually rent a space for a physical boat, right? There's tons of ways that you can do that, right? Maybe you rent it from somebody who lives in your community, has a whole dock built, and you want to rent that space from, right? It's not necessarily going to stop somebody else with a boat of the same dimensions from coming in and parking in the same spot. Well, that's the thing, is that these receptors that are all over the dendrites, not just one neurotransmitter docks, usually there's several different types of neurotransmitter that can dock at the exact same spot. And it's the same thing with something like GABA or glutamate, where you'll remember glutamate means fire and GABA means don't fire. So in terms of the latter, in terms of don't fire, in terms of GABA, something else that binds with or docks at the exact same dock, same receptor, right, is ethanol, right? Ethanol in terms of active component, active ingredient, right, when it comes to alcohol, right? So what happens is that when I drink something, when I drink alcohol, for example, right, yes, it's going to go to my liver, it's going to get processed, blah, 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 right? And eventually it's going to end up kind of swishing around in terms of my system in my brain. But the thing is, not everything passes through this barrier. It's called the blood-brain barrier, and it's an evolved mechanism to be able to make sure that toxins are not allowed into your brain, okay, to be able to influence stuff. But there are other chemicals that get through, right? There are other compounds that get through, and one of them is ethanol. And basically it tricks your brain into believing that it has more GABA than your brain actually has, right? Because think about it, right? If you haven't, gotten back from your cruise yet, you haven't docked it yet, right? There are all other kinds of boats that are kind of circling around maybe because there's a boat show in your area, and one of them is going to come and they're going to dock in your spot. This is the same thing. Just because you haven't told your brain to do something that releases GABA, if you're drinking alcohol, right, then it's essentially going to release a whole bunch of those boat show boats into your brain, and it's going to start docking. And this is the reason why you get so many of the different impacts that you get when you get drunk or when you get tipsy, right? It shuts down parts of your brain, and in some ways it may be very unattractive. For example, slurring your speech. It impacts your cerebellum, which means that, in terms of, you may be teeter-tottering or you just can't stand up straight. And it's also going to significantly impact your judgment, right? But at the same time, parts of the brain that are also going to get shut down are the ones that may inhibit you from actually approaching that person you find attractive, or maybe things that give you kind of a fear response such that your nonverbal communication with the person who you like, maybe those nonverbals are going to be really, come across really negatively, right? So for instance, maybe somebody comes up to you, whatever, and you're not making a lot of eye contact because it makes you anxious, versus when you have something to drink, that part of the brain, basically, because GABA's saying, chill it out, you're able to keep that eye contact. You're able to literally chill. You're able to speak more slowly, appear more confident. This is why people call it liquid courage, right? That's the reason why, is because that's what it does. So it has some impacts that are not great, because obviously if your decision-making centers are getting kind of dampened, if not fully shut off, then what's going to happen is that you can make some really bad decisions, right? You can do things that you would not do when you were sober and have all of your faculties, with you. However, it's also going to be something that is going to give you that leg up if it's something where you're inhibiting yourself socially from having these kinds of engagements that you may actually like to have or desire to have, okay? So that is how alcohol works in the brain. So how can we practically apply this information? So one thing is that usually as Christians, when we think about anything about, especially if you're raised in the church, I feel, right? You hear about alcohol, you hear about getting drunk, you hear about, in some cases, bars and clubs and these things. It can make you really anxious, and we can get very judgy very fast. We can get very judgmental. We see a friend get drunk, we think that they're loose with their morals, we think that, they're not a good Christian, which is kind of like, that's a really ballsy thing to say. Like, honestly, it's very important to be able to withhold that judgment. But it's something that is very human to be able to do. especially if it's something where we struggle ourselves with being, let's say, socially competent. It's something where sometimes it's self-medication. That's what we're doing. If we deeply desire fellowship, we deeply desire a partner, we deeply desire to be able to have social interaction, but we can't do it normally, we seek something to be able to make that easier. And in that way, alcohol can almost be used as a tool. So I understand that, and I understand the conflicting pressures that we can put on ourselves in terms of, on the one hand, thinking to ourselves, well, I want to use it as a tool because I want to have those social interactions, and on the other hand, almost this self-shaming or the fear of judgment, be it from God, be it from our friends and colleagues or our family members. And we're always so critical on ourselves, right? Almost having a hard time looking at ourselves in the mirror after having had this kind of an interaction, right? Of an experience in our own lives, of maybe having one too many or making what we perceive to be a fool of ourselves, whatever it happens to be. But we have to put that shame to the side for a moment, okay? And if you're feeling ashamed right now, I want you to really take some time with God in terms of solitude and really pray on this and really plug into the vine, as they say, right? And experience that peace. And I'll pray for you at the end of today's session, right, in that regard. And it's one of these things where when you feel, full up again, when you feel recharged, then it's something where we can actually, practically address this issue. Because I am not telling you never to touch alcohol or never to drink. Now, there are individuals who biologically are more likely to get clinically addicted to alcohol. And if that's the case, there is no shame in that whatsoever. So if you're watching that and you think, hey, maybe that's me, I think I may actually have an issue with that, please don't hesitate to be able to talk to somebody. Talk to the pastoral team, talk to a licensed clinician. It's wonderful to go to therapy. It's wonderful to be able to seek out help. God has given individuals these skill sets to be able to help us, brothers and sisters. It's incredibly important to feel blessed that other people have that knowledge and that science has progressed in mental health sufficiently that there are individuals out there who can actually facilitate recovery. That said, if you are in one of those camps, then it is something where you should avoid alcohol, right? And that can be really challenging. For example, for myself, I would say that I have an addiction to refined carbohydrates, which some people may say, oh, that's not a real addiction, da-da-da. But if I really think about it, the way that my body responds when I have refined carbohydrates, and now I go off the rails and sometimes gain really quite a bit of weight, etc., is all clinically addictive behavior. So everyone has things that they have the propensity or the higher likelihood of getting addicted to, and there is no shame in talking about it or admitting it, okay? But it is the case that there are some individuals, no shame in it, where you should just avoid alcohol. Fair enough, right? We'll talk a lot about on this channel about other things that some people can't handle, right? And should not handle in terms of things like substances, okay? Which are proxies for things that we should actually be diving deeper to in terms of our faith. So, what I want you to think about in terms of if you do find, though, that you may be using alcohol as a tool, is I want you to think about scaffolding on a house, okay? So the idea here is that when a house is built, right, you don't just literally stack the bricks and all and then the house is built. No, what do you usually see if you're driving around your neighborhood and a new house is going up? There's all of this scaffolding around it, usually metal, right, scaffolding that's around it. And it's used to be able to essentially provide the necessary supportive structure for the underlying structure to get stronger, get it set, get all the dimensions correct, and then eventually when you remove that scaffolding, the structure is able to stand independently and be just as strong as if that scaffolding, that support was still there. So the issue that I feel usually happens when it comes to brothers and sisters in alcohol is the use of alcohol as a tool, but it's almost like leaving the scaffolding up, as opposed to saying, what am I using the alcohol for? So for example, let's say that maybe our social skills just aren't great. It happens, right? Not everybody is, the highest socially competent individual, but that's something you can work on. We're all about optimization on this channel, as you guys know, and getting ahead in terms of our own lives, physically, spiritually, socially, you name it. And this is one thing that we can work on in terms of social competence and moving that forward. So what I'd like to suggest is that you think about and really do some deep dive into this. Think about it with yourself, with some trusted brothers and sisters, talk to maybe pastoral team or a clinician, whoever, but spend a lot of time praying on it, a lot of time in solitude with God praying on it, to think about what is the function that alcohol is playing in our lives. For example, it may be that we're trying to escape. Maybe we have a really stressful life, right? Work is not going well. Family is not going well. There are so many pressures and stresses. We just want to escape for a brief period of time. And we use alcohol as a method of being able to do that. Maybe that's what that is, okay? Again, there is no shame in that. Once we recognize the function that the behavior is serving, then we can get to the root of it. But we have to acknowledge, us recognizing it. Other people can tell us, it doesn't matter. Until we actually take ownership and responsibility for it, nothing's actually going to change, okay? So once we can recognize what that function is that alcohol is serving, it could be escapism, right? It could be trying to decrease barriers or obstacles to us being socially competent, right? So again, calming down our nonverbal. So for example, the speed of speech, calming it down, right? For example, for guys, one thing that is routinely seen as not the most attractive thing is overuse of eyebrow flashing, and we can talk about that sometime. Right? It's a primate signal, it's an evolved signal of submission, right, and of resource sharing. So, and we can go all into this kind of stuff. I find it fascinating, right? You can leave me a comment below if there's any specific questions you have about that, and I'm happy to answer them for you. But once we recognize the function that the overconsumption of alcohol is serving in our lives, then we can think about head on how we can actually address it. And what I want you to think about is that it is okay, right? We can't go from like 100 miles an hour to 0 miles an hour. I want you to think about making incremental changes. This could be 1% a day. It could be 10% a week. It could be something like this. Don't try to do cold turkey. Don't try to do, just 50% of these things. Always consult a licensed medical professional, please, or just a licensed behavioral health professional before getting into any program with significant biological changes that could happen, or anything that could be occurring within your physical body, okay, including your brain. And what I want you to do is to start making meaningful, incremental changes to be able to get to that goal. And I want you to slowly start to increase resources while decreasing reliance on the scaffold, which is alcohol. So for example, if something that we're struggling with is social competence, right? There are so many books on assertiveness training, boundary setting, social skills training. There are so many resources out there that you can take a look at. And as you start to increase that competence and then go and practice in the community, go to church, go to small group, talk to the person who's standing in front of you in line at the grocery store, talk to the person who's also checking into the same time that you're checking into the gym, whatever it happens to be, right? But get that practical experience to increase access to that skill set and simultaneously, gradually reduce reliance on the scaffold. And what you're going to find, instead of feeling a real sense of loss, you're going to feel a deep sense of gratification, right? Of reinforcement of doing these things, because that means you are pushing your life forward and you are better able to stand on your own 2 feet. And this is something that is going to impact you in many different areas of your life, right? Spiritually, obviously, physically, obviously, mentally, socially, so many different areas. So I want you to just practice that, right? Try to identify those different areas. As always, if it's something where you would like to speak directly with me about that so that we can work one-on-one in a coaching capacity to be able to work on this, to be able to get you to the point that you want to be at, especially when it comes to the dating and relationship and attraction space, then please leave me a message at these contact details below via the site, and we'll go on from there. But I appreciate you taking the time and spending it with me today. God bless you. Let's close with a quick prayer, okay? Father, thank you so much for the opportunity, Lord, to be able to have this platform to speak, Lord, with brothers and sisters as well as with colleagues and new friends from all over the world. Lord, I pray that whoever is watching this video, Lord, if they're in a time of need, Father, especially if it has to do with alcohol or drugs, Lord, that they just be so supported, Lord, in your love and be so assured, Father, of you, of your strength, Lord, and that there's nothing that we could do, Father, to be further from you, that you won't push us away, Father, and that you'll never deny us, and that your love, Lord, is always there for us, and it's always more than we need, Lord. So I pray, Father, that you just come around my brothers and sisters, if they're believers or non-believers, Father, it doesn't matter, and you just be with them, Lord, with your tremendous and overwhelming love, Father. And I pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, everyone. God bless you. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you so much for stopping by. If you enjoyed that episode and you'd like to see more original content, then please do click on one of the links right here. I hope to see you in the next one.